Welcome to this collection of stories for the beginning of a year. The new year has arrived, the calendar has turned. And yet here, in this quiet space, we pause not to rush forward, but to gently release what we carried from before. Tonight, we gather 6 tales of letting go stories carried down from temples and mountain paths, from monks and wanderers who learned that release is not loss, but freedom. You need do nothing but rest. Let your body soften into the surface beneath you. Let your breath slow to its own rhythm. There is no hurry here, no task, no place you must be. These stories will unfold gently, one by one, each a quiet companion as you drift towards sleep. They ask nothing of you. They hold no urgency. They simply unfold the way snowfall settles on a winter mountain, soft and inevitable and kind. Let the year behind you rest. Let what was be what was. The new year does not ask you to carry old weight into its days. It invites you, instead, to set things down, to soften your grip, to trust that you can walk lighter now. Tonight, you need only breathe and listen, and allow yourself to be held by the stillness that lives beneath all things. The first story begins now. A monk named Genzo had carried a stone in the pocket of his robe for 7 years. It was smooth and dark, no larger than a plum, worn round by some river long ago. He had found it on a morning when grief was fresh, the day after his teacher had died. The stone had been resting beside the path near the meditation hall, half buried in moss, and when Genzo bent to touch it, it had felt cool and steady in his palm. He had slipped it into his pocket without thinking, and from that day, it had traveled with him, through seasons, through ceremonies, through long stretches of silence in the monastery and the occasional journey down the mountain to the village for rice and oil. The stone had been there, a small weight against his thigh, a presence he did not name but could always feel. He did not know why he kept it. It had become a habit, like breathing. On the first morning of the new year, Genzo woke before dawn in his small room at the edge of the monastery grounds. The air was sharp and cold. Frost had formed delicate patterns on the wooden window frame, each line of ice catching the faintest suggestion of moonlight. He sat up slowly, pulling his blanket around his shoulders, and for a long moment he simply sat, watching the pale square of the window and the dark shape of the mountains beyond. The monastery was silent, everyone still sleeping. Outside, the world was holding its breath. The pines stood motionless against the sky. The stone path that led from the meditation hall down toward the valley was dusted with a thin layer of snow that had fallen in the night, soft and undisturbed. The stars were fading. The sky was not yet blue, but no longer black, a pale gray, luminous and vast, stretched over the peaks. Genzo rose, dressed in his robe, and stepped outside into the winter morning. The cold touched his face immediately, clean and sharp. His breath misted in the air. He stood on the wooden porch of his room for a long moment, his hands tucked into his sleeves, looking out at the quiet monastery grounds. The meditation hall was a dark silhouette to his left. The garden, dormant under snow, lay still to his right. Somewhere far below, hidden by mist and distance, the valley held villages and rivers and fields sleeping under frost. He began to walk. His footsteps made soft sounds on the stone path, muffled by the thin layer of snow. Each step left a shallow print. He walked slowly, not with intention toward any destination, but simply because his body wanted to move, and the morning invited him forward. The path curved through a grove of pine trees. Their branches hung low, weighted with snow. Occasionally a small clump would fall, landing with a soft thump on the ground, and the branch would spring upward, released. Genzo watched this happen once, twice, the snow falling, the branch lifting. He reached into his pocket, as he had done 10,000 times before, and felt the stone. It was there, cool, smooth, familiar. He walked further. The path led him to the edge of the monastery grounds, where a low stone wall marked the boundary between the cultivated land and the wild forest beyond. Here, the path ended. Beyond the wall, the mountain continued upward, steep and dense with trees, but there was no trail, only wilderness, only silence. Genzo stopped at the wall and stood looking out over the valley below. The mist was beginning to lift. He could see the pale shapes of distant hills emerging from the gray. The sky was growing lighter now, a soft wash of color spreading from the east, pale gold, pale rose, the faintest touch of blue. The air smelled of pine and snow and something else, something he could not name, the scent of winter, the scent of stillness. He stood there for a long time. His hand still rested in his pocket, his fingers curled around the stone. And then, without deciding to, he took it out. He held it in his palm, looking down at it. In the growing light, he could see the small flecks of quartz embedded in its surface. He could see the way the river had worn it smooth, the way time had shaped it. It was just a stone. It had no meaning. It carried no magic. And yet he had carried it for 7 years, as if it held something he could not lose. He thought of his teacher. The old man's face rose in his mind, gentle and lined, the way it had looked in the last days. The soft sound of his breath in the stillness of the room, the way his hand had felt light and cool when Genzo had held it. He had not wanted to let go. Genzo stood at the wall, holding the stone, and he realized something he had not allowed himself to see before. He had been holding grief, not the stone. Grief. The stone had simply been a place to keep it, a small, solid thing he could carry when the feeling itself was too vast and formless to hold. It had been a way of saying, "I remember, I will not forget, I will not let you go." But 7 years had passed, and his teacher was not in the stone. The morning grew brighter. The sky turned from gray to pale blue, and the first rays of sunlight touched the distant peaks, turning the snow there a soft gold. Genzo stood very still, feeling the weight of the stone in his hand. It was such a small thing, and yet it had been so heavy. He looked out at the valley, at the mist lifting, at the light spreading slowly across the land. And then, very gently, he opened his hand. He did not throw the stone. He did not cast it away with force or ceremony. He simply opened his fingers and let it fall. It dropped from his palm, tumbled once in the air, and landed softly in the snow at the base of the wall. It made no sound. It simply rested there, half buried, as it had been when he first found it. One stone among many, part of the mountain, part of the earth. Genzo stood looking at it for a moment, and then he turned and walked back toward the monastery. His pocket was empty. His hand felt light. The path behind him still held his footprints, dark marks in the pale snow, leading back to where he had come from. But ahead, the path was smooth and undisturbed. The morning was new. The year was new. And he walked into it with nothing in his hands but the cold air and the quiet and the feeling of being, for the first time in a long time, enough. And somewhere not far from there, another story unfolds. In a village at the base of the mountain, a woman named Aya sat alone in her small house on the first morning of the new year. The house was quiet. Outside, the village was still sleeping. The narrow lanes between the wooden houses were empty. Smoke had not yet begun to rise from the chimneys. The sky was pale and clear, and the air carried the sharp cold of winter, clean and bright. Aya sat at her low table near the window, her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the bare branches of the persimmon tree in her garden. The tree had given fruit in the autumn, heavy orange globes that had hung from the branches like small lanterns, and she had harvested them all. Now the tree was bare. Its black branches reached up toward the pale sky, empty and still. On the table in front of her lay a bundle of letters. They were tied together with a thin cord. The paper yellowed with age, the ink faded in places. There were perhaps 20 of them, maybe more. She had not counted. They had been written over the course of many years, sent from a sister who lived far away in a city Aya had never seen. The letters spoke of a life Aya did not share, of streets and crowds and noise, of work and worry and the small joys that punctuated days lived far from this quiet village. Her sister had died in the autumn. The news had come by messenger, a young man who had traveled many days to bring word. Aya had received the message in silence. Standing in the doorway of her house, the late afternoon light slanting across the floor behind her, she had thanked the messenger. She had given him tea and a place to rest, and when he had left, she had gone inside and sat at the table, and she had not moved for a long time. Since then, she had read the letters again, all of them, one by one, slowly. She had unfolded each page with care, traced the familiar handwriting with her eyes, heard her sister's voice in the words. She had read them in the evening by candlelight. She had read them in the morning when the house was cold and still. She had read them until she could recite whole passages from memory. And now it was the first day of the new year, and the letters lay on the table in front of her, waiting. Aya sat very still, her gaze resting on the bundle. The cord that held them together was old, frayed at the edges. She had tied it herself years ago, when the first letter had arrived. Each time a new letter came, she had untied the cord, added the new page to the bundle, and tied it again. It had become a ritual, a way of keeping, a way of holding on. But now there would be no more letters. The silence outside deepened. The village remained still. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, its voice sharp and clear in the cold air. Aya listened to the sound fade, and then there was only quiet again. She reached out and touched the bundle with one finger. The paper was soft, worn smooth by her hands. She could feel the texture of it, the slight roughness where the ink had soaked into the fibers. She could feel the weight of all the words her sister had written, all the days and thoughts and small moments that had been captured and sent across the distance between them. She thought of her sister's face, the way she had looked when they were young, before the sister had left for the city, the way she had smiled, the way her voice had sounded when she laughed. Aya could still see her, standing in this very room many years ago, packing her small bag, preparing to leave. She had been so eager, so full of plans, and Aya had stood in the doorway, watching, saying nothing, feeling something tighten in her chest that she did not have words for. She had not wanted her sister to go, but her sister had gone, and the letters had come, one by one, over the years. And Aya had kept them all, each one a small thread connecting her to the life her sister had chosen, the life that did not include this village, this house, this quiet. Aya sat at the table, her hand resting on the bundle, and she felt the familiar ache rise in her chest. It was not sharp, It was not new. It had been there for months now. A dull weight that lived beneath her ribs, a sadness that had no edges, no beginning, no end, just a presence, a heaviness. She thought, I do not want to let go. The morning grew lighter. The sun rose higher, though it was still low in the winter sky, and its light fell across the floor of the room in a pale rectangle, reaching almost to where she sat. The persimmon tree outside the window cast thin shadows on the ground, delicate and intricate like lace. Aya looked at the letters, and then, slowly, she reached out and picked up the bundle. It was lighter than she expected. She held it in both hands, feeling its weight, its shape, just paper, just words, and yet it had been everything. It had been her sister's presence, her sister's voice, the proof that they had not been separated, not really, not entirely. The proof that love could travel across distance and time, could survive in ink and paper, could wait patiently on a table for years and still be real. But her sister was gone now, and the letters were just paper. Aya stood, holding the bundle against her chest, and walked to the door of her house. She slipped on her sandals and stepped outside into the cold morning. The air was sharp and bright. Her breath misted. The village was still sleeping, but she could sense the day beginning to wake, the slow stirring of life behind closed doors. She walked through her small garden, past the bare persimmon tree, to the stone hearth at the back of the house. The hearth was used for burning offerings, small ceremonies, the occasional autumn fire to dispose of dried leaves and branches. It was cold now, the ashes from months ago still resting in the bottom, gray and soft. Aya knelt beside the hearth. She placed the bundle of letters inside, arranging them carefully, as if even now they deserved tenderness. She did not move for a long time. She knelt there, her hands resting on her knees, looking at the letters lying in the ashes, the cord still tied around them, the paper still whole. She thought of all the words they held, all the days, all the moments. She thought of her sister writing them, alone in a room far away, thinking of this village, thinking of Aya. She thought of the care it had taken, the time, the intention, and she thought, this is how I remember. But she also thought, this is how I stay. The letters kept her tethered to what was. They kept her looking backward, holding on, refusing to let the past be past. And her sister would not want that. Her sister, who had always moved forward, always reached toward the next thing, would not want Aya to live in the shadows of old words. Aya closed her eyes. She took a long, slow breath, and then she reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small piece of flint and steel, the kind used to light kitchen fires. Her hands were steady. She struck the flint once, twice, and a spark fell into the hearth, landing on the edge of one of the letters. The paper caught immediately. A small flame appeared, pale and delicate in the morning light. It spread slowly across the first letter, curling the edges, turning the paper black. The fire grew. It moved from one page to the next, following the threads of ink, consuming the words gently, tenderly, as if it understood what it was taking. Aya watched. The flames rose higher, yellow and gold, and the smoke lifted into the air, thin and gray, drifting up toward the pale sky. She could smell the burning paper, a dry, clean scent. She watched the letters disappear, one by one, the handwriting vanishing into ash, the words releasing into the air. She did not cry. She simply watched. And as the last of the letters crumbled into embers, she felt something shift inside her. Not a breaking, not a tearing, something softer, a loosening, a release. The fire died down, The smoke thinned and faded. The ashes settled in the hearth, pale and light, and the morning breeze stirred them slightly, lifting a few small flakes into the air where they floated for a moment before disappearing. Aya knelt beside the hearth, her hands resting on her knees, and she looked up at the sky. It was clear and pale and vast. The persimmon tree stood bare against it, its branches reaching upward, empty and unafraid. And Aya thought, she is not in the letters, she is not in the words. She is in me, in the way I see the world, in the kindness I learned from her, in the laughter we shared, in the silence we trusted, and that cannot burn. Aya stood slowly, brushing the ash from her hands. She looked at the hearth one last time, and then she turned and walked back into her house. The morning was growing warmer. The village was waking. She could hear voices now, distant and soft, and the sound of a door opening somewhere down the lane. She went inside and closed the door behind her. The table by the window was empty now. The pale light fell across it, clean and bright. And Aya sat down, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked out at the bare branches of the persimmon tree, and she felt, for the first time in many months, that she could breathe. And elsewhere, on the same morning, another quiet tale waits to be told. An old carpenter named Ichiro lived alone in a workshop at the edge of a forest, where the trees grew tall and the light fell in soft green columns through the canopy. His workshop was a simple structure, built of wood and stone, with wide doors that opened to the east and a roof that sloped gently to shed rain. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and cedar and the faint sweetness of pine resin. Ichiro had been a carpenter for most of his life. He had learned the trade from his father, and his father from his father before him, and the tools he used had been passed down through generations. Chisels with wooden handles worn smooth by countless hands. Saws with blades that sang when they cut through wood. Planes that could shave a surface so fine it felt like silk under the fingertips. He was skilled, he was careful, and he was known, in the villages nearby, as a man who could make anything from wood tables and chairs, door frames and beams, delicate carvings for temples, sturdy boats for rivers. But on the first morning of the new year, Ichiro stood in his workshop looking at something he had not made for anyone else. It was a small wooden box. He had been working on it for 3 years. The box sat on his workbench, unfinished, its surface half smooth, half rough. It was made of cherry wood, dark and rich, with a grain that flowed like water. The lid was hinged with small brass fittings he had salvaged from an old chest. The corners were joined with dovetails so precise they seemed to disappear into the wood itself. It was beautiful, and it was useless. Ichiro stood looking at it, his hands hanging at his sides, and he felt a familiar frustration rise in his chest. The box had no purpose. No one had commissioned it. He had not made it to sell, or to give, or to use. He had made it simply because he had wanted to, because the idea of it had come to him one day, and he had thought, I will make a perfect box. And he had tried. For 3 years, he had tried. He had worked on it in the evenings, after finishing the projects that paid for his rice and his firewood. He had worked on it in the early mornings, before the light was strong enough for other tasks. He had sanded and planed and adjusted, over and over, trying to bring the box closer to the image he held in his mind. The perfect box, flawless, complete, a thing of absolute beauty. But it was never right. Every time he thought he was close, he would notice something, a slight unevenness in the lid, a tiny gap where the hinge met the wood, a place where the grain did not flow as smoothly as he wanted, and he would start again, sand it down, adjust the angle, try once more. The box had become an obsession. Ichiro stood in the pale morning light, his workshop quiet around him, and he looked at the box and felt tired. Not the tiredness of the body, but something deeper, a weariness of the spirit. He had poured so much into this small object, so much time, so much care, so much hope that if he could just make this one thing perfect, then something would be proven, that his skill was real, that his life had meaning, that he was, in some way, enough. But the box was still unfinished, and he did not know how to let it be. The morning was cold. A thin mist drifted between the trees outside, and the light that came through the open doors of the workshop was soft and gray. Ichiro reached out and picked up the box, holding it in both hands. It was light. The wood was smooth under his fingers, warm from the room. He turned it over, examining the underside, the joinery, the small imperfections he had tried so many times to remove. He thought, if I keep trying, I can fix it. But he also thought, I have been trying for 3 years. He stood there for a long time, holding the box, and then he walked to the doorway of his workshop and looked out at the forest. The trees stood tall and still, their trunks dark with moisture from the mist. The ground was covered with a layer of fallen needles, soft and brown, and here and there patches of moss grew in the shadows, bright green against the earth. The forest was quiet, not silent, but full of small sounds, the faint drip of water from a branch, the rustle of a bird moving through the underbrush, the distant creak of a tree swaying in a breeze he could not feel. Ichiro stepped outside, still holding the box. The air was cold and damp and smelled of earth and wood and winter. He walked slowly away from the workshop, following a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The path was familiar. He had walked it many times over the years, gathering wood, clearing fallen branches, simply moving through the trees when his mind needed space. He walked until he reached a small clearing where a stream ran through, narrow and shallow, its water clear and cold. The stream moved over smooth stones, making a soft sound, a gentle murmur that never stopped. Ichiro stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the water, and then he knelt down on the damp earth. He placed the box on the ground in front of him. It sat there, small and unfinished, the cherry wood dark against the brown needles and green moss. Ichiro looked at it, and he felt something heavy settle in his chest. He thought of all the hours he had spent, all the nights he had stayed late in the workshop, sanding by candlelight, adjusting hinges, trying to shape the wood into something perfect. He thought of the hope he had carried, the belief that if he could just finish this one thing, just make it right, then he would feel complete. But he did not feel complete. He felt stuck. The box had become a trap, a thing that held him, a symbol of everything he thought he should be, everything he thought he should achieve, and the endless distance between that ideal and the reality of his hands, his skill, his life. Ichiro knelt beside the stream, his hands resting on his knees, and he looked at the box for a long time. And then, very slowly, he reached out and picked it up. He held it in both hands, feeling its weight one last time, and then he stood and walked to the edge of the stream. The water moved past, clear and cold, flowing over the stones, moving always forward, never stopping, never looking back. Ichiro took a breath, and then he placed the box in the water. It floated for a moment, bobbing slightly on the surface, the cherry wood dark and slick, and then the current caught it, gentle but insistent, and it began to move downstream, slowly at first, turning in small circles, and then faster as the water carried it away. Ichiro stood watching it go. The box moved around a bend in the stream between two large stones, and then it disappeared from sight. The sound of the water continued, unchanged. The forest stood still around him. The mist drifted through the trees, soft and gray, and Ichiro stood at the edge of the stream, his hands empty, and he felt something release inside him. Not relief, not joy, something quieter, a softness, a letting go. He thought, it was never about the box. It was about me, about trying to prove something that did not need proving, about holding myself to a standard that had no mercy, no room for the simple reality of being human, about believing that perfection was possible and that anything less was failure. But the trees in the forest were not perfect. They grew crooked and straight, thick and thin, and they were beautiful. The stones in the stream were worn smooth by water, shaped by time, and they were beautiful. The moss grew where it could, in cracks and shadows, imperfect and alive, and it was beautiful. And he, Ichiro, with his old hands and his worn tools and his unfinished projects, was enough. He stood by the stream for a long time, watching the water move past, and then he turned and walked back through the forest to his workshop. The mist was beginning to lift. The light was growing warmer. He could hear birds now, their songs soft and hesitant in the cold morning air. When he reached the workshop, he stepped inside and looked at his workbench. There were other projects there, things people had asked him to make, things that would be useful and needed and appreciated. A chair for an old woman in the village, a shelf for a young family, a set of bowls that a temple had commissioned. He picked up his plane, its handle smooth and familiar in his palm, and he began to work. His hands moved with care, but not with fear, with attention, but not with obsession. He worked as he had always worked, shaping wood, honoring its grain, making things that would serve and last. And the box, somewhere downstream, floated on. The fourth story begins in a temple garden, where winter has quieted everything. A young nun named Kiko had tended this garden for 5 years. She had arrived at the temple as a novice, uncertain and searching, and the abbess had given her this task: care for the garden, learn from it, let it teach you. And Keiko had done so. She had learned the names of the plants. She had learned when to water and when to let the rain do its work. She had learned to prune the azaleas in late winter, to rake the gravel paths in patterns that pleased the eye, to sit among the stones in the early morning and simply watch as the light changed and the shadows moved. The garden had become her world. It was not large, perhaps 30 paces from one end to the other. There was a pond in the center, shallow and clear, where koi moved slowly beneath the surface. There were stone lanterns placed at intervals along the paths. There were maple trees, bare now in winter, their branches dark against the pale sky, and there were beds of moss, green even in the coldest months, soft and silent. Keiko loved the garden. She loved the way it changed with the seasons, the way the cherry trees bloomed in spring, covering the ground with pale petals, the way the cicadas sang in summer, loud and insistent in the heat, the way the maple leaves turned red and gold in autumn, falling one by one into the pond, and the way winter came, stripping everything bare, leaving only structure and stillness and the quiet shapes of things. But on the first morning of the new year, Keiko stood at the edge of the garden and knew that something had changed. The abbess had called her the evening before into the small room where she met with the nuns for guidance and instruction. Keiko had knelt on the tatami mat, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. The abbess had looked at her for a long moment, her face calm and lined with age, and then she had spoken. "You have cared for the garden well," she had said, "but it is time for you to let it go." Keiko had not understood. The abbess had continued, her voice soft but clear. "Another will tend it now. You are being asked to join the others in the meditation hall. Your practice will deepen there. The garden has taught you what it can. Now you must learn from stillness." Keiko had bowed. She had said, "Yes, teacher." She had returned to her small room and sat by the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the trees, and she had felt something break inside her chest. Now, on the first morning of the year, she stood at the entrance to the garden, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her robe, and she looked at the place that had been hers for so long. The gravel paths were raked in neat lines, the way she had left them the day before. The stone lanterns stood where they had always stood, weathered and solid. The pond reflected the pale morning sky, its surface smooth and still. The maple trees reached their bare branches upward, intricate and beautiful in their emptiness. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. And yet Keiko felt as though she were standing at the edge of a loss she did not know how to measure. She stepped onto the path, her feet making soft sounds on the gravel, and began to walk slowly through the garden. She moved as she had moved 1,000 times before, her gaze taking in each detail, each small element that made up the whole. She passed the first stone lantern, its surface covered with a thin layer of frost that caught the morning light. She passed the azalea bushes, their branches bare and waiting for spring. She passed the pond, where the koi moved slowly beneath the surface, dark shapes in the clear water. She walked to the far corner of the garden, where a small bench sat beneath one of the maple trees. She had placed it there herself, years ago, dragging the heavy wooden seat across the gravel and positioning it just so, in the spot where the light fell most beautifully in the late afternoon. She had sat on this bench countless times, in every season, in every kind of weather. She had sat here when she was tired, when she was confused, when she needed to think, or when she needed to stop thinking. She sat down now. The wood was cold beneath her. The air was sharp and still. She looked out at the garden, at the paths and the stones and the trees, and she felt a grief so deep she could not name it. This garden was not hers. She knew that. She had always known that. The garden belonged to the temple. It belonged to the earth. It belonged to no one. And yet, she had given herself to it so completely that it had felt, in some quiet way, like home, like the place where she was most herself, like the only place that made sense. And now she was being asked to leave. Keiko sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, and she closed her eyes. She listened to the sounds of the garden, the faint drip of water from a stone basin, the soft rustle of a bird moving through the branches above, the distant sound of the temple bell, marking the hour. She thought of all the mornings she had spent here, all the small tasks she had performed with care, watering the moss, clearing leaves from the pond, trimming branches, raking gravel. Each task had felt important. Each task had felt like prayer, but the abbess had said it was time to let go. Keiko opened her eyes and looked at the garden again. She looked at the maple tree above her, its branches bare and strong. She looked at the way the frost had settled on the stones, delicate and temporary. She looked at the pond, where the koi continued to move, unbothered, unaware that anything was changing. And she realized something. The garden did not need her. It had existed before she came. It would exist after she left. The seasons would continue to turn. The rain would fall. The snow would come. The cherry trees would bloom again in spring, whether she was there to see it or not. The garden had never needed her. She had needed the garden. She had needed a place to pour herself into, a place to feel useful, a place to believe that her effort mattered, that her care made a difference, that she was necessary. But the garden had been teaching her something else all along. It had been teaching her about impermanence, about the way things grow and change and die and return, about the way beauty exists, not because it is held, but because it is released. The cherry blossoms were beautiful because they fell. The leaves were beautiful because they changed color and let go. The seasons were beautiful because they moved, always, toward the next thing. And she, Keiko, was being asked to do the same, to let go, to move, to trust that what came next would be enough, even if she could not see it yet. She sat on the bench for a long time, feeling the cold seep through her robe, feeling the stillness of the winter morning settle around her. And then, slowly, she stood. She walked back through the garden, past the pond, past the stone lanterns, past the azaleas and the maple trees. She walked to the entrance, where the gravel path met the wooden walkway that led to the temple buildings. She stopped there and turned to look back one last time. The garden was beautiful. It was perfect in its winter stillness. It asked nothing of her. It gave everything simply by being. Keiko bowed, deeply, from the waist, her hands pressed together in front of her heart. She bowed to the garden, to the stones, to the trees, to the seasons, to the 5 years she had spent here, to the lessons she had learned and the lessons she was still learning. And then she straightened, turned, and walked away. Her footsteps were soft on the wooden walkway. Behind her, the garden remained, quiet and still. The morning light spread slowly across the gravel paths. The koi moved beneath the surface of the pond. The maple branches swayed slightly in a breeze too gentle to be felt. And Keiko walked toward the meditation hall, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her heart aching and open and lighter than it had been in days. And in another place, at the same hour, another story finds its shape. There was a merchant named Taro who had once been wealthy. He had owned a shop in a prosperous town, selling tea and silk and fine ceramics. He had traveled to distant cities to acquire goods. He had employed several workers. He had lived in a large house with rooms he rarely entered and possessions he rarely used. But fortune had turned, as fortune does. A fire had destroyed his shop. Debts had accumulated. Illness had kept him from working for many months. And slowly, piece by piece, everything had been sold or lost or given away to settle what he owed. Now, on the first morning of the new year, Taro lived in a single small room in a lodging house at the edge of the town. The room was barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a small wooden chest. There was one window, narrow and high, that let in a thin column of morning light. The walls were bare. The floor was cold. He owned almost nothing. A sleeping mat, a blanket, 2 robes, a wooden bowl, a pair of sandals, and inside the chest, wrapped carefully in cloth, a single ceramic cup. The cup was all that remained from his former life. It was pale blue, glazed with a pattern of waves, and it had been made by a master potter in a village far to the south. Taro had purchased it many years ago, when he had been young and ambitious and certain that beauty was something that could be owned. He had loved the cup. He had used it only on special occasions, treating it with reverence, washing it carefully, storing it in silk. It had been, in some way, a symbol of everything he had worked for, proof that he had taste, that he had means, that he was someone. Now it was the only thing of value he had left. Taro sat on his sleeping mat in the small room, the morning light falling across the floor in a thin stripe, and he held the cup in his hands. He had taken it from the chest, unwrapped it from the cloth, and now he sat looking at it, turning it slowly, feeling the smooth glaze under his fingers, seeing the way the light caught the pattern of waves. It was beautiful, and it was useless. He could not drink from it now. Not here, in this bare room, with nothing to fill it with but water from the communal well. To use it would be to diminish it somehow, to bring it down to the level of his current circumstances. And so he kept it wrapped, kept it hidden, kept it safe. But for what? Taro sat with the cup, and he felt a heaviness settle over him. He thought of all he had lost, the shop, the house, the workers, the life he had built with such effort and care. It had all dissolved, like smoke, like mist, and he had been left with nothing but this one small object. And even this he could not enjoy, because to enjoy it would be to accept where he was, to accept that he was no longer the man he had been, to accept that the cup, beautiful as it was, could not restore what was gone. He thought, if I sell it, I will have nothing left. But he also thought, if I keep it, I still have nothing. The morning outside the window was growing brighter. He could hear sounds from the lodging house, footsteps on the stairs, voices in the hallway, the clatter of someone preparing a meal in the communal kitchen. Life continuing, people moving through their days, carrying whatever burdens they carried, finding whatever joys they found. Taro looked at the cup for a long time, and then he stood, still holding it, and walked to the door of his room. He slipped on his sandals, pulled his robe tighter against the cold, and stepped out into the hallway. He walked down the narrow stairs and out into the street. The town was waking. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few early vendors were setting up their stalls in the market square. The air smelled of charcoal and steamed rice, and the faint sweetness of roasting chestnuts. People moved past him, wrapped in thick clothing, their breath misting in the cold air. Taro walked through the town, still holding the cup, until he reached the temple at the far end of the main street. It was a modest temple, with a wooden gate and a courtyard paved with stones. A large bell hung to one side, silent now. A few offerings had been left on the steps: rice, incense, small coins. Taro climbed the steps and stood before the altar. He looked at the statue of the Buddha, seated in stillness, hands resting in the lap, face calm and distant. He looked at the offerings others had left, and then he looked at the cup in his hands. He thought, this is all I have. And then he thought, no, this is all I am holding. There was a difference. Having and holding were not the same. He had lost everything, yes, but he had also been holding on, gripping tightly, refusing to let this one last thing slip away. And in holding it, he had made it a prison, a reminder of what was gone, a weight that kept him tethered to the past. Taro stood on the temple steps, the morning light falling across the courtyard, and he felt something shift inside him, a loosening, a softness. He bent down and placed the cup carefully on the step among the other offerings. He set it there gently, as if it were still precious, because it was, but it was not his anymore. It was an offering, a gift, a release. He straightened and stood looking at it for a moment. The pale blue glaze, the pattern of waves, the way the light touched it, and then he turned and walked back down the steps, into the courtyard and out through the gate. His hands were empty. His chest felt light. He walked back through the town, past the market stalls, past the vendors setting up their wares, past the people moving through their morning routines. He walked slowly, feeling the cold air on his face, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet. When he reached the lodging house, he climbed the stairs to his small room and sat down on his sleeping mat. The room was bare. The wooden chest sat against the wall, empty now except for the cloth that had wrapped the cup. Taro sat in the thin stripe of sunlight that fell across the floor, and he closed his eyes. He thought, "I have nothing." And then he thought, "I am free." The past was gone. The shop, the house, the life he had known, all of it was gone, and no amount of holding on could bring it back. But he was still here, still breathing, still capable of walking through a town, of climbing steps, of feeling the cold air and the morning light. He was still alive, and that, perhaps, was enough. Taro sat in his small room, his hands resting on his knees, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief. Something quieter, a kind of peace. A sense that he could begin again, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was, unburdened, unadorned, enough. And somewhere in the mountains, where the air is thin and the silence deep, another story unfolds. A hermit named Daichi had lived alone in a small hut for more than a decade. The hut was built of wood and stone, perched on a hillside where the forest began to thin and the mountain rose steep and bare above. There was no path to the hut, no road. Only a faint track through the trees, overgrown and difficult to follow, that led from the valley below. Daichi had chosen this place intentionally. He had chosen solitude. He had chosen silence. He had walked away from the world of villages and temples and people, seeking something he could not name but felt pulling at him, a need for stillness, for space, for a life stripped of distraction. And for 10 years, he had lived that life. He woke with the dawn. He meditated in the morning light. He gathered firewood and melted snow for water. He ate simply rice, dried vegetables, wild plants he foraged from the forest. He sat for hours watching the light change on the mountainside. He listened to the wind. He listened to the silence. It had been, for a long time, enough. But on the first morning of the new year, Daichi woke in his small hut and felt something he had not expected, a loneliness so deep it ached. He sat up on his sleeping mat, pulling his blanket around his shoulders, and looked at the walls of the hut. They were rough and gray, patched in places where the wind had worked through the cracks. The floor was bare earth, hard and cold. The hearth in the center of the room held only ash from the night before. The single window, a small opening covered with oiled paper, let in a pale wash of morning light. The hut was silent. The mountain was silent. Everything was still, and Daichi felt, suddenly and sharply, the weight of his solitude, not as a chosen practice, not as a discipline, but as a burden, a separation. A wall he had built so carefully around himself that he could no longer see over it. He rose slowly, stiff from the cold, and walked to the doorway of the hut. He pushed aside the cloth that served as a door and stepped outside into the winter morning. The world was white. Snow had fallen in the night, a thin layer that covered the ground and the trees and the rocks. The air was sharp and still. The sky was pale and clear, and the sun had not yet risen over the ridge above. Everything was bathed in a soft, cold light. luminous and fragile. Daichi stood in the doorway, his breath misting in the air, and he looked out at the silent landscape. He had stood here countless times before. He had watched countless dawns. He had found beauty here. He had found peace. But this morning, he felt only absence. He thought of the people in the valley below, the villagers waking in their homes, families gathered around hearths, children laughing, neighbors greeting each other on the paths between houses. The warmth of shared meals, the comfort of voices, the simple, ordinary presence of other human beings. He had walked away from all of that. He had believed that solitude would bring him closer to truth, that silence would reveal what the noise of the world obscured, and perhaps it had. In some ways, he had learned to sit with his thoughts. He had learned to endure discomfort. He had learned to find stillness within himself, but he had also learned that stillness, taken too far, could become emptiness. Daichi stood in the doorway of his hut, the snow crunching softly under his feet, and he felt something rise in his chest. Not fear, not regret, something gentler, a recognition, a quiet knowing. He thought, I have been here long enough. He did not decide this in a moment. It was not a sudden revelation. It was something that had been growing inside him for many months, perhaps even years. Something he had not allowed himself to see, because to see it would mean admitting that the life he had chosen, the path he had committed to, was not the path he needed anymore. But now, on the first morning of the new year, he saw it clearly. He had come to the mountain to learn solitude, and he had learned it. He had practiced it. He had lived it so fully that it had become second nature, as easy as breathing. But there was nothing left to learn here. The mountain had taught him what it could. The silence had given him what it could, and now it was time to return. Not because he had failed, not because solitude was wrong, but because he was ready, because he had changed, because the man who had walked up the mountain 10 years ago was not the man standing here now. Daichi turned and went back inside the hut. He moved slowly, deliberately, gathering the few possessions he had: his blanket, his bowl, a small knife, a flint for starting fires. He rolled them into a bundle and tied it with a length of cord. He looked around the hut one last time, at the rough walls, the cold hearth, the bare floor. He had lived here for 10 years, and now he was leaving. He did not feel sadness. He did not feel loss. He felt something lighter, something like gratitude. The hut had sheltered him. The mountain had held him. The silence had taught him, and now it was time to let go. He stepped outside, shouldering his small bundle, and began to walk down the hillside. The snow was soft under his feet. The trees stood bare and still around him. The faint track that led through the forest was barely visible, but he knew it by heart. He had walked it many times over the years, down to the valley to trade for rice, to gather supplies, and then back up again, always back up, to his hut, to his solitude. But this time, he was not coming back. He walked slowly, carefully, placing each step with attention. The forest was quiet. The morning light filtered through the bare branches, casting long shadows on the snow. He passed familiar landmarks: a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a stream hidden under ice, a grove of pines where he had sometimes stopped to rest. He walked for a long time. As he descended, the air grew warmer. The snow thinned. The forest became denser, greener, the trees closer together. He began to hear sounds he had not heard in years: the call of a crow, the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush, the distant sound of human voices carrying on the wind. And then, as the sun rose higher, he stepped out of the forest and onto the edge of a terraced field. Beyond it, he could see the village, smoke rising from chimneys, small figures moving between houses, the sound of a dog barking, the faint clatter of work beginning. Daichi stood at the edge of the field, his bundle on his shoulder, and he looked at the village. It had been so long, he did not know if anyone would remember him. He did not know if he would be welcome. He did not know what he would do, or where he would go, or how he would live, but he knew he was ready. He took a breath, feeling the warmer air fill his lungs, and he began to walk down toward the village. The snow was gone now. The ground was brown and soft. His feet made quiet sounds on the earth. The morning light spread across the fields, golden and bright, and he walked into it, step by step, leaving the mountain behind. He thought, "I am not the same." And he thought, "That is good." The past 10 years were not wasted. They were not a mistake. They had been necessary. They had shaped him, but they were finished now. And the man walking down from the mountain was a man who had learned solitude and was now ready to learn connection, a man who had learned silence and was now ready to learn voice, a man who had let go of the world and was now ready, gently, carefully, to return. And in a quiet room, as evening falls, the final story finds its rest. An old woman named Sato sat alone in her house at the edge of a village on the first evening of the new year. The day had passed quietly. She had heard the sounds of celebration from the village, laughter, music, the voices of families gathered together, but she had stayed in her house, as she always did. Sato was very old. Her hair was white, her hands gnarled with age. She moved slowly, carefully, her body stiff and reluctant. She had lived in this house for more than 50 years. She had raised children here. She had buried a husband here. She had watched the seasons turn over and over through the small window that looked out onto the village path. Now her children were grown and gone, living in distant places. Her husband had been gone for many years, and she lived alone, tending to herself as best she could, moving through the small routines that made up her days. On this evening, she sat by the hearth, a small fire burning low, and she looked at a wooden comb that lay on the table beside her. The comb had belonged to her mother. It was old, worn smooth by decades of use, its teeth slightly uneven. Her mother had used it every morning, sitting by the window, combing her long black hair with slow, careful strokes. Sato could still see her, still hear the soft sound of the comb moving through her hair, the quiet rhythm of it. Morning after morning, her mother had given her the comb many years ago, on the day Sato had married. "Keep this," she had said. "Remember me." And Sato had kept it. She had carried it with her into this house. She had placed it on the small table by her sleeping mat, and every morning she had picked it up, held it for a moment, and thought of her mother. But she had not used it, not once. Her own hair had been short for many years. The comb had no function. It was only a memory, a way of holding on. Sato sat by the hearth, the firelight flickering on her face, and she held the comb in her hands. She turned it over slowly, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the slight weight of it. She thought of her mother. She thought of all the years that had passed. She thought of how much she had held, and how much she had lost, and how much still lived inside her, carried like stones, like weights, like quiet griefs that had no name. She was so tired, not the tiredness of the body, though her body was tired, a deeper tiredness, the tiredness of carrying, of remembering, of holding on to everything that had been, as if releasing it would mean losing herself. But she was old now, and the new year had come, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, I do not need to carry this anymore. Sato stood slowly, her knees protesting, and walked to the door of her house. She opened it and stepped outside into the cold evening air. The village was quiet now. The celebrations had ended. Lanterns glowed in a few windows, but most houses were dark. The sky was clear and full of stars, countless and bright. She walked to the edge of her small garden, where a stone path led to the village well. She stood there, the comb still in her hand, and she looked up at the sky. She thought of her mother, not with grief, but with love. She thought of the woman who had given her life, who had taught her to cook, to sew, to endure, who had combed her hair when she was small, singing softly, who had held her when she cried, who had been strong and kind and flawed and human. And she thought, she is not in this comb. She is in me, in the way I move through the world, in the kindness I offer, in the strength I have carried all these years. And I do not need wood to remember that. Sato knelt slowly, carefully, and placed the comb on the ground at the edge of the garden. She pressed it gently into the soil, covering it partway with earth, leaving it there as an offering, as a release, as a way of saying, thank you, I remember, and now I let go. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and she looked at the place where the comb rested. It was barely visible in the darkness, just a small shape in the earth, and she felt, for the first time in many years, light. She turned and walked back into her house. She closed the door behind her. She sat by the hearth, the fire still burning low, and she looked at the table where the comb had always been. It was empty now, and that was good. The new year stretched ahead of her. She did not know how many more years she would have. Perhaps this would be her last. Perhaps she would see many more. It did not matter. What mattered was that tonight, on this first evening of the new year, she had set something down. She had released a weight she had carried for decades, and in doing so, she had made space. Space for breath, space for rest, space for whatever came next. Sato sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, and she felt, finally, at peace. The fire burned low, the room grew dark, and outside, the stars continued their slow turn across the winter sky, infinite and bright and unburdened by memory. And so we come to the end of these 6 stories, here on the first days of the new year. 6 people in 6 places, each learning the same quiet truth, that letting go is not loss. It is freedom. The year behind you has carried you this far. It has held you, it has shaped you, and now, gently, it asks you to release it. Not with force, not with regret, but with gratitude, with kindness, with the understanding that what was necessary, and what comes next will be necessary too. You need not hold everything. You need not carry every stone, every memory, every expectation, every old grief. You can set things down. You can walk lighter. You can breathe. The new year is here. It is quiet. It is patient. It waits for you, unburdened and open. And you, just as you are enough. Rest now. Let these stories settle around you like snow. Let them hold you as you drift. Let them remind you that release is possible, that peace is possible, that you, even now, are free. Sleep well. The year is young, and you are held